Okay, why don't we get started? So this is welcome everyone. I'm Mike Stager, your host tonight. I tend to host the Saturday night discussions. We've got a special beginning to a new class series with our featured speaker, Tony Pappert. And I think we already have some people throwing into the chat box. You know, someone's an educator from Canada. I think this is probably a critical topic that's already dominating much of the political discourse in our country today. Given the kinds of not just the paucity of decent education, but the outright criminal attempts for indoctrination now, with critical race theory, the hardcore environmentalism, anti-human tendencies now dominating much of public schools and education. And yet the debate has, and this is dominating school board fights and parents getting involved. You've got the whole question of gender and gender bathrooms and sports and all of the just obscenities that are now dominating educational culture. The problem is that much of this has become something of a structure question. What's the structure? Where does the money go? As if somehow putting the money in the right place will make everything work. It doesn't. I mean, in some sense, maybe that's true, but of course, it's a question of what is education? What is it for? So I'm not going to touch more on that because that's really Tony's wheelhouse tonight and over the next 3 or so Saturday evenings to kind of elevate this discussion in a way that Lyndon LaRouche and people like Tony, who work with Lynn beginning back in the middle of the 1960s, have a unique understanding of how to approach this, because it's not something new. The rot of American education has gone on now for decades. But before we begin the discussion tonight, and we're looking for a lot of feedback. I think everyone out there has had some experience with this question, especially if you have young children or grandchildren interfacing the education process today. And so we do want to hear stories and understandings or insights. We want to encourage people to become active in this regard from the highest standpoint. But let's just situate what happened this week, and especially over the last couple of days, just very briefly, because what was exposed was that our current administration, what we might call I like to call the zombie collective, because they all seem to be part of the Walking Dead, have been exposed as the naked. They're walking naked, and now many of the American people and certainly the mainstream press might not be aware, but the entire world has quickly become aware of this. You might almost call this current administration, the adventures of Joe Quixote and his and his squire Sancho Pothead. So, because it really is just a bit of a joke of this stumbling fool, with his so-called sense of adventure, barely able to climb the stairs to Air Force One. That was, an achievement if he made it to the top. And as like it almost as a reversal of time, back to his boyhood days where he would salute at the top like a proud young boy that made it up the stairs. At the same time, he's calling Vladimir Putin a killer with no soul. This blowhard interview. And then his team of delegations to meet with China for the first time end up touring the Pacific, South Korea and Japan, with these kind of transatlantic Council on Foreign Relations, hardcore British orientation. Then they sanction a bunch of Chinese on the eve of their travels over Hong Kong. And then they meet with the Chinese and decide to speak to them as if they're somehow a minor partner in the world economy. And the Chinese just blow open the bankruptcy, the utter bankruptcy of the American, and really it's really more the transatlantic establishment as a whole. It's dying. And the doddering old fool of Joe Quixote is just really a clear example of that. Putin's response was perhaps best. As people might have seen it, Putin said, this is in the children's schoolyard or play yard. It was well known that if you called someone else soulless, that was really a reflection upon your own state of mind. And perhaps nothing more true in terms of the strategic situation and dangers could be said. The fact that we have a soulless presidency, we have a soulless and bankrupt establishment attempting to run our country and the world, where we're facing major economic, political, and cultural crises. That has to be changed. That has to be addressed. And we've got to do that now. We've got to pull together a functioning government. What President Trump demonstrated over 4 years was far beyond competence. He understood the kinds of brokering a new kind of economic system, as well as maintaining good relations with major nations like Russia and China, as he was always want to say, it's a good thing. Working with Russia and China is a good thing. And so the question, though, is why has it gotten so bad? Why is this foolishness, this kind of senility now dominating the American government, whether it's Pelosi and Schumer or Biden and his pothead friend Harris? Why have the American people accepted such a bankrupt establishment for so long? And there's a deeper question there all of us have to address. And I think that the main question in my mind, and I think in the discussion tonight, is how do we elevate now the American people back to a quality of that unique spirit of enterprise that Alexander Hamilton identified, that quality of genius that is so important to self-government in our republic. So on that, I will, I think, hand it over to Tony. I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. I'm sure you are too. So Tony, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mike. So what we intend to do is devote about 3 weeks or 3 Saturdays to what has to be done with education in the United States, how we have to educate our young people, especially. It's just one front in an overall people's war, as we've called it on these presentations. It's one front in an overall people's war to regain the Republican institutions of the United States, to regain the sovereignty of the United States, to reinstitute the American system. It's one front in that war, as it has been for all of American history back to colonial days, as we may have occasion to discuss, although I'm not intending to discuss that tonight. But it is one vital front in what Lynn has called, and others, of course, have called, people's war, to retake the United States, which is going on as we speak now. Now, I mean, to begin with just a simple truth, our society must be in real trouble if we choose to run all of our institutions, or virtually all of our institutions, the people who are the least educated and the most miseducated of our entire population, which is liberal arts BAs from four-year colleges. Obviously, there's variations, but to put it as a general term, we have the least educated, the least qualified, the most ignorant, the most prejudiced, the most arrogant, running just about everything. And they are these four-year liberal arts BAs. And then, of course, some of them have suffered even more with advanced degrees, who know absolutely nothing, but imagine they know something. So let that be our starting point. We've chosen the worst and put them in the positions of responsibility, which no way can they handle. Now, we're used by now, of course, I'm sure I'm I'm not that old, but I'm older than many in the audience. But by now, we're very used to the fact that people are routinely, or young people are routinely graduating high school without hardly the ability to read. The ability to read with difficulty, if at all, or only very simple material, and with no ability to do elementary calculations of arithmetic, or almost no ability. So we're used to that by now because it's been going on for many years, unfortunately. What's new, as Mike mentioned just a moment ago, is not only are they graduating unable to read, write, or calculate, to put it in a word, but they're forced through, we never thought we would see this in America, say in the 1960s. They're forced to not learn, but they're forced to agree with their teachers that Americans should be judged by the color of their skin. I mean, when could we have imagined in, say, 1968 and 1970, bad as things were then in other ways, when could we imagine that children would be indoctrinated in school into racism in our own public schools? And the other thing, and the less said, the better, I guess, but the other thing we're not used to, but we see today, is counseling in schools for children to so-called change their gender through surgery and drugs without the consent or even the knowledge of their parents. Again, if a decade ago I had said that this was going to happen, I'm sure none of you would have believed me. So, I mean, the thing is a stinking mess. It's got to be, what we're doing now has got to be thrown out the window and something better substituted. And what I'm going to try to devote the coming 3 sessions to is not criticizing any further, except as necessary maybe, but not criticizing any further what's wrong, but going in some depth, as much as I can, with the help of your questions, into what we should replace it with. Now, as Mike said, and it's obvious, let me just say it quickly, there's a lot of discussion in print and internet, same thing, on the problems of the American education system and what should be done about them. But the answers, for some reason, given are structural and financial. School choice, school budgets, the structure of school boards. I recently read a proposal that all school administration should be changed so that the parents in a particular local school have a major voice in the curriculum and in what's done in their own particular local school. We also have advocates of homeschooling and so forth. Now, it's not that any of these things are necessarily right or wrong, at least I don't think they are, but they don't answer the problem at all. I mean, the problem is what should be taught, how it should be taught, what do we need, what do we want and need our young people to get from the educational process itself, regardless of whether it's public, private, in-home, school choice, or any of the other things. What is education, or what is the education we need? Now, we need now, at the beginning of the 21st century, or almost the beginning. Now, it would be tempting, and I think many tend to make this mistake, it's understandable, to say, return to the 1950s. That's what we need, because in the 1950s, compared to today, we came out able to read and write and do simple computations, maybe some other things thrown in on top. But this is not, in fact, what we need. We need to restore the rigor of the 1950s. We need to throw out the window the so-called progressive reforms, which began in the 50s, basically, which were the first step toward the putrid mess we find in schools now. So to that extent, yes, we have to return to the 50s to the extent of removing the filth, which has been shoved in there since, and returning the rigor to the extent it did exist, which existed in the 1950s. But otherwise, this is not what we want. I mean, Bob Ingram, who's done these classes just before me, pointed out to me a day or two ago that all the people at Woodstock 1969 who were rolling in the mud and drugs and whatnot were, every one of them, products of the educational system of the 1950s. So clearly it wasn't perfect. But the other thing is we're in a new century with new needs, which will ever increase for scientific knowledge and other related forms of cultural knowledge, and the ability to learn the new things which will be developing in physics, in biology, in chemistry, and in other sciences as we go to the moon, to Mars, and further explore and begin to colonize the solar system, all of which should happen during this century, and perhaps some of it well before the end of the century. So the requirements are much greater than people realized in the 1950s. So I mean, I guess I'll have more to say about that in a way, but the way back to the 1950s, and people can discuss it, but the way back to the 1950s, in my view, is not the way we should go, because we want to produce from our high schools people who, when they come out of high school, as I wrote on our website, are independent thinkers, by and large, are original thinkers, as most people can be, and people have the ability to concentrate on a problem through time, through distractions, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are qualities, of course, we need in our scientists, but they're qualities we want in our citizens. I mean, if we had a citizenship which had those qualities, admittedly, it's a rather broad definition, but if we had a citizenship which had those qualities, would we have had a presidential election stolen out from under us, as we just did a little while ago in November? Would we have a Supreme Court, as President Trump pointed out, which lacked the guts to rule on the issue and use procedural pretext? Other courts did the same, of course, use procedural pretext to avoid ruling on actual allegations of fraud and irregularities. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. Now, how do we achieve that? Let's look at the individual student in this case, or the individual young person, not simply as an individual as such, but let's look at him in his development over history, that since before written history, since the human species came into existence, maybe as long ago as 1 million years, I don't think this is yet fully known, but hundreds of thousands of years ago, the species has been unique among all living species in the ability to creatively redefine its environment, its way of life, to change, to make through cognition, through mentation or thinking, to in effect change its own species characteristics. I mean, you know, we here sitting having a Zoom conference call, biologically, we're the same biological individuals as our ancestors were 1,000 years ago. But the things we are able to do today in any other form of life would be equivalent to actually a species change. Say from a species which couldn't fly to a flying species. We've done that ourselves by creative breakthroughs in thinking. That's what it's done. That's what's caused it. So this is the long chain. Schiller called it the golden chain. The great German poet Friedrich Schiller called it the golden chain of human evolution, which has gone through perhaps 1 million years of history, which links us backwards to people whose names we know in certain cases. Thomas Edison is a name. To people before them whose names we don't know, but we know what they discovered. The discovery of the equinoctial cycle. The discovery, we don't know, this was discovered by human beings. We don't know their names, but we know surely enough they discovered it, and we can, to some extent, date the discovery. So we're part of this long process. We're not just an individual as such. The young person today going through school is the forward crest of a wave where the back end of the wave is hundreds of thousands or 1 million years ago. In his life, what we want him to do and what he wants to do is to represent the progress, hard-won progress of the human species up to this point in history, to add to it in some way and to carry it forward for coming generations. And this, I mean, the human species actually, if we do it right, is the only eternal species. We are, there's nothing outside of us that can end the human species. As Abraham Lincoln said of the United States, there's nothing outside the United States that can put an end to the United States. It can only come from mistakes or evil doing by Americans. That's what he said in that case. The United States, nothing outside the United States can end it. Similarly with the human species. The human species is the only, every other species has a beginning and an end. It evolved, and after a certain point, circumstances will change, it will no longer exist. The human species is the only intrinsically eternal species. And so the individual, say the individual student, is not simply an individual located in empty space, or maybe he has parents, grandparents. No, not at all. He's part of this wave, which is the development of the human species in its as a species, meaning in its moral and its intellectual character. So that's the way the individual student has to be seen, and that's the way the kind of educational program which Lyndon LaRouche outlined, which I'm going to re-outline here. I'm also going to refer you to his writings on it if you want to read them. But that's the way this educational program sees the individual student. Another way to ask the same question or make the same point is to ask, how long can we plan? And I'm not talking about a planned society in the sense of crazy Friedrich von Hayek, but we're planning ahead for certain things. We have the plan to put the first woman and the next man on the moon in 2024, which Trump started. Hopefully Biden will be forced to continue that program to go on from there to Mars. So, that whole thing is, it's 3 years now to 2024, and then, Mars within some decades later. I'm not sure you can say exactly when at this point, but say that's a plan of 30 or 40 years. How far ahead can we plan? Maybe we can plan 30 or 40 years. What happens after that? Well, we can't plan it today. Progress must continue. Humanity must advance. Our understanding, our morality must continue to improve, but it's no longer up to us. It's up to the students we are educating today, or the children we are raising today, to be students, to go to school, and so on and so forth. It's up to them. So what becomes of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? You know, for the next 40 or 50 years, you and I and the other people on this call, to some extent, we can determine that. And we're determined to actually bring the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence back by getting rid of all these people who have falsely assumed the office of the presidency and falsely assumed the whole administration of the country. Well, we're going to get rid of them and get our Constitution and Declaration of Independence back. But our effort to do that will span the coming decades. What happens afterwards is up to the people we're educating today, or in other words, it's up to the way we educate them today. Now, let me say, I was flashed a text question which said, when does discussion begin? My intention is it should begin within a half hour, that is by 8 p.m. Eastern. I'd like to finish by then and allow an hour of discussion. But that's approximate one way or the other. So now the basic, or the most basic method, one of the basic methods of education, which LaRouche proposes, and which LaRouche rightly proposes, and which he demonstrated to us many times when he was alive, he died in early 2019, is that we prepare ourselves to make the discoveries of the future, whatever they may be, we don't know, whatever the future may require of us, we more generally, we don't know. We prepare ourselves to make the discoveries of the future by standing on the shoulders and looking out through the minds of the great discoverers of the past. That is what teaches us, in effect, discovery. Discovery cannot be, in one sense, it can't be taught, because discovery is discovery of something qualitatively new. So you can't give the student in advance the qualitatively new thing, but you can prepare his mind to do that by putting him through the experience of the previous discoverers who have brought us to the place where we are today. That's the most basic, or one of the most basic elements of education, as I see it and as LaRouche saw it. So having said that, let's move to one of our areas of instruction or departments in our school, and in a writing, or in two writings I'll share with you from LaRouche if you want to read them. He lays these out in fact, more detail than I'll be able to. But let's go to the Department of History. What are we going to study as history? What we're going to study as history is the history and the prehistory of the United States of America, going back all the way to the origin of the human species. Whether that sounds extreme or exorbitant to you, I don't know, it may. But the reality is that throughout all of written history there have been great thinkers who have aspired toward creating the republic which we did create here in the United States in the 18th century. And of course, which we created the republic in the 18th century, but many of its features were prefigured in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and elsewhere during the colonial period, before we defeated the British militarily. So the figures of the Renaissance, Machiavelli, the Dante, also Dante's political writings, De Monarchia, Abelard, and then going back to going back to Charlemagne. I mean, Charlemagne's reforms, with the influence of his counselors and so forth, were in the interests of what came to be known as the Commonwealth, which prefigured the Republican form of government of the United States. The concept of the Commonwealth was a prefiguring of the American Republic. And then we go back to Plato, of course, who wrote the book, The Republic, just about this. I mean, the creation, it's not his only book on that subject. He wrote another one called The Laws. But The Republic was about the creation of a republic such as ours, which couldn't be done, for 2,500 years roughly. But yet it was eventually done. And Plato pointed back to Egyptian predecessors of his who were working at the same problem. And that's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily end there. My knowledge may end there, even maybe our written records end there. But this has been an aspiration of mankind as far back as we know. And I think with what we know of man, as man, it's been an aspiration of man from the beginning. The creation of a republic such as this, with the goals stated in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, such as the pursuit of happiness, which is in Leibniz sense means the pursuit of the ability to do the good, and the general welfare, which is a concept that goes way back through history. So in the Department of History, we're going to study the progress toward the creation of the American Republic over history, and then after its creation, its struggle for survival, the struggle to create the same thing in Europe, which was drowned in blood of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, the revived struggle in the 19th century for the same thing, the struggle in France toward this, the struggle in Russia, the struggle in Germany, which again, the struggle toward a republic, and I shouldn't take too long on these things because it's not my main point, but the struggle in Europe of the 19th century to create American republics in Europe was drowned in the blood of World War I, followed immediately by World War II. The two, I think, bloodiest wars in history, launched by our enemies of the British Empire in order to forever, if they could do that, forever prevent the recreation of anything like the American Republic on the continent of Europe or in Britain itself. So and this is what we'll study, and we'll study it not as I'm saying it to you now, rather gray, just words of description, which carry some meaning, but not really the meaning we want. But we'll study it through the minds of those who actually created the leaps in this struggle through their creative ideas. And we'll study the key turning points in this struggle through the eyes of those who lived them. And that's, yeah, I mean, that's what I intend to finish with. And I find it much more interesting than any of the preceding material, which was really introductory. The greatest educational influence on me by far has been Lyndon LaRouche, as Mike alluded to. I've worked with him for about 55 years, since I was a student in college, and worked with him all the while since, until his death in early 2019. And I mean, he has shaped my outlook more than anything else could possibly, and it's true of many other people as well. There's no way I can't communicate that, and as such in the course of this talk, but presumably it becomes clear in one way or another. But there were two particular reading studies I did, in both cases, many years ago. The first one I did, I think, as a freshman in college, and the second just after graduating college in 1967. The second was the first historically, which was what's known as various titles: The March of the 10,000. The author is Xenophon, Xenophon, and it's known by other titles, but as well. But Xenophon wrote other books, but this was his great work of his personal experience. It took place the events took place roughly 400 BC. At that time, the Babylonian Persian Empire dominated the whole known world of the Mediterranean, despite the fact that Greece had earlier beat off the attempt of the Persian Empire to conquer Greece. Despite that, the Persian Empire dominated the Mediterranean, or the civilized and populated area of the Mediterranean. And all the nations on the Mediterranean were what we call satrapies, which was a Persian word. They were satrapies, or colonies, puppets of the Persian Empire. So Xenophon was a young student of Socrates. He was in his 20s in around 400 AD and BC, excuse me. And he became aware that a pretender to the Persian throne, whose name was Cyrus — this is not Cyrus the Great of the earlier centuries, but it is called Cyrus the Lesser, but Cyrus is just a Persian name. A pretender to the Persian crown, who was pro-Greek, at least relative to the other Persian royalty, intended to seize the crown from his half-brother, and was recruiting, along with a great many other mercenaries from other countries in the Mediterranean. He wanted to recruit 10,000 Greeks as part of a massive army to march all the way around the Mediterranean, at least as the Greeks saw it, to Babylon, which was then the capital of the Persian Empire, to defeat and kill his brother and take over the empire. Xenophon went to Socrates, his teacher, and asked permission. And it appears to me that Socrates was favorable toward the project. So Xenophon went along with the expedition of 10,000 Greeks, but a great many other thousands, a much larger number of other nationalities, under the command of Cyrus, to seize the empire. And what was shown in every day of the expedition was how the character, and you could call it, in a sense, the proto-Republican character, but it wasn't really exactly that. But the more civilizationally developed and more human character of the Greek mercenaries, and mercenaries though they were, was totally different from the Persian troops and the other mercenaries of various nationalities who had been recruited. So that as the Greeks formed into their phalanxes and faced the opposing enemy, whom they called barbarians, meaning non-Greeks, but when they faced their enemy, it never came to battle. The enemy always ran away, just seeing the Greeks organize their phalanxes ready to fight. In fact, one day, Cyrus and his noble Persian friends organized a military parade. They set up a stadium, they set up bleachers. The Persians sat in the bleachers, and Cyrus said, okay, form up your phalanxes, do this, do that. So after the exercise was over, the leading Greek general, just for a lark, he sent them all charging to the bleachers, and the Persians all jumped over the bleachers and ran off. So this is what they confronted in March around the known world at that time, pretty much all the way around the known world to Babylon. When they approached Babylon and they were in sight of the forces that the half-brother emperor had organized there, unfortunately, Cyrus let his character get the better of him, as this has happened in other times, and he decided to charge off through the Persian ranks as a sole individual for a single combat with his brother or his half-brother. And he was chopped to pieces before he ever got anywhere near his half-brother. So the pretender and the commander of the force was dead. They were halfway around the world from home. They were in the very suburbs of Babylon with no general. Okay, fine. It's not a very good situation. The Persians, the forces of the Persian emperor, said, well, okay, this has happened. Why don't you come over for dinner and we'll talk about it? So all the Greek generals accepted the invitation, went to dinner in the Persian tents. And sometime I believe in the evening, one single Greek soldier went running back to the Greek camp, trying to hold in his guts with his hands. He had been disemboweled. But nevertheless, he thought he had to get them the message, which was that all the generals have been slaughtered. So now you had 10,000 Greeks in the thousands of miles, or that seems to me several thousand miles from home, in the suburbs of the enemy capital. The foreign mercenaries who were non-Greeks had melted away as soon as Cyrus died. So it was just the Greeks alone, sitting in the middle of the Persian Empire, 1,000 miles from home. So Xenophon, this I'm remembering from my freshman year in college. I haven't read it since. Xenophon notes that was a bad evening, as you can imagine. He said the sentries didn't keep proper watch. I mean, everything was a mess. People were a bit discouraged. And eventually Xenophon went to sleep. Now, I should say, which I hadn't, that he had not joined the expedition as a soldier. He had joined it as a student observer. So he wasn't wearing armor. He was just wearing the ordinary Greek dress of the time. In any case, eventually he got to sleep. And he dreamed that lightning was striking his father's house. He woke up in the very early morning, he went to the chest where he had packed a suit of armor, or, regular military costume and a weapon, put on the weapon, called in the very early morning an assembly of the Greek soldiers, all of the 10,000, because they were pretty much all there, and said to them, this has happened. We have no leader. The generals have been killed. All this is true, but we have prevailed in every engagement. We can do it now. If we stick together, if we maintain our unity, if we maintain military discipline, we can get home despite the fact that we're in the heart of the enemy empire, thousands of miles away. And in fact, that's what they did. They returned all the way around the Mediterranean to home. They lost more men from frostbite because they were going over mountains, snow-covered mountains, wearing open sandals. So they lost many more men to frostbite than to enemy action. And then finally, they came and saw once more the Aegean from a hill. So, some of the soldiers had mounted to the top of the hill, and from the top of the hill, they cried out, "The sea, the sea," because the Greeks were sea people. And so they all raced down as fast as they could to step into the sea because they were home. So this was a great turning point. It marks a great turning point in history because what it meant, and there's many things you could say about it, I suppose, but what it meant in historical terms I'm going to cite now is that the Persian Empire was rotten to the core. There was nothing. It's like the so-called Biden administration. There was nothing there. It was just waiting for somebody to give it a puff and no more Persian Empire. That's what it proved. And it proved it to Alexander the Great, who did that with minuscule, decades later, with minuscule forces. He demolished the Persian Empire. So this was a great turning point in history, and I was able to see it. I was unbelievable to me, frankly. I just couldn't believe I was doing this. To see through the eyes of a real Greek in 400 BC, who was a student of Socrates. I mean, he knew stuff. Unfortunately, while he was on this expedition, Socrates was judicially tried and judicially murdered by the Athenians, and he never saw him again. And he himself was exiled from Athens in his absence. So I don't know if he ever got back, but he didn't immediately get back to Athens. But this was a great turning point in history, seen out through the eyes of an individual participant. And the other thing, many of you again may have read Xenophon's account. It had special meaning to me because when I was reading it, I was a student of Lyndon LaRouche, a modern day Socrates. I had just recently, it was just recently I had met him, but that was an additional reason. I saw myself in Xenophon. And I just say as an appendix to that the features of ourselves which are most personal and most inward, we generally consider to be, I think, we generally consider to be most special and most unique. But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, the most inward features, in fact, can be the most universal. And the situation of Xenophon it's totally different, but it bears certain similarities to ours. And the call he received in the night from his father's house, meaning his family, that he had to be the leader to rescue the situation, is an inner call, which is at the same time a historical a phenomenon of total historical importance. Now, it was an earlier point before I met Lyndon LaRouche that I read St. Augustine's Confessions. And again, I mean, this St. Augustine played really a much more important role as an individual, but than did Xenophon, as important as Xenophon was. But I mean, again, this is about 300 AD, and the rotting carcass of the Roman Empire, again, it brings us so much to our present situation, where the rotting carcass of the British Empire is stinking up the world and preventing progress and snuffing out life. That's what the Roman Empire was doing at that time. It was a complete moral abomination. And of course, so, and then this pervades St. Augustine's Confessions. I'm not going to tell you his whole life story. I do recommend you read his Confessions, very worth reading. But the whole, to me, the whole import of it, I can put together in the story, which you may know otherwise, of his favorite student, Alypius. I mean, at the time, Augustine was a professor, what we would today call an English professor, and a very famous professor. He wasn't yet, in practice, a Christian saint, but he was some sort of a Platonist, and he was trying best he could within his lights to improve the outlook of his students. One of them, Alypius. And a key issue was the so-called the circus, some circus, where it's just like video games today, except that people are really stabbed to death in front of you for your entertainment. And people would do, they were called the circus or the games, and people would go to them day after day for the video game-like thrill, the addictive thrill of watching their fellow man being killed and cut up, or sometimes eaten by wild animals. So Alypius, like Augustine, his professor, forswore the games, the circus and so forth, forswore this mess. He would never go. And one day, his friends were just making a real pest of themselves, Alypius' friends, saying, you've got to come, it's really going to be great, you have to come. He said, well, I'm so much above it that I tell you what I'll do. I'll go with you to the circus and cover my eyes. And so I'm so proof against this temptation, let's call it, that I can be there and not be there. I can cover my eyes, sit with you, and it's just as if I wasn't at this bloody circus, which he did for a while, until a series of screams rose up from the crowd, followed by one huge roar. And he just involuntarily, in curiosity at what they were all roaring about, he uncovered his eyes. He saw a man being killed. Surprise, this is what this entertainment consists of. He became addicted to it, and he went to every game and even brought others. So this really happened. Now, Augustine, was part of the crew which rescued us from the rot of the Roman Empire, which would have extinguished human civilization, at least in Europe. That's what it was doing. Year by year, the population was decreasing. It didn't stop in 300 AD either. Year by year, the population was decreasing. Cities were disappearing. And during this period, if not 300 AD, Augustine was from North Africa, Roman colonies in North Africa, which were formerly the Carthaginian Empire. But the same was happening there. Cities disappearing, population disappearing, year by year, decade by decade. So I don't remember the year, but I think by 500 AD, 200 years later, you would find wolves in the streets of Rome. So European civilization under the Roman Empire was being crushed to death. Just like what will happen here under the Green New Deal. And if you don't believe me, we can discuss that too. So again, this was formative in my own life. I'm sure I haven't communicated it adequately, and I wouldn't even pretend my simply talking about it would be formative in yours. But this is the experience of, again, a student reliving the discoveries which have created our civilization. And as I say, in this department of history, we will study history from the point of view of this constitutional republic, which has been the culmination of history up to this point. And of course, not only through the founding of the republic, but our two wars with Britain in the 19th century, our isolation after the failure of the French Revolution, our Civil War, our progress since, our back and forth fight, principally with the British Empire, up to the present. And we would attempt to study it in that way. So I'm sure, I've said various things. There's a lot left unsaid, and that'll become probably immediately clear in questions. But I think I'll do what I said and turn it over to questions right now.